Welcome back, students. It's Professor Bridget again. This is part 2 of the connective tissue lecture. So before we move on, let's kind of think about where we left off last time. In the last lecture, we learned about some of the properties of connective tissue, some of the functions of connective tissue, and the components of connective tissue. Remember that there are various types of cells, various types of fibers, and also ground substance. So remember that we've got 3 things that make a connective tissue a connective tissue. So 1, ground substance, and remember that ground substance, its consistency can vary from fluid to solid, and there are a variety of fibers present, and there are a variety of cells present. So those 3 things are the 3 main components of connective tissue. Now remember, as the ground substance consistency changes, or the fibers are different, or the cells are different, this creates slightly different structures in the connective tissue, which also creates different functions. And with different functions of connective tissue, that means the different types of connective tissues will be found in different locations. Remember the 3 things I asked you to always think about when we're learning anatomy? There's structure, function, and location. So I would hope that for all of the connective tissues we're about to discuss, you'd be able to describe their structure, their function, and their location, where you find them. So we didn't get into any of the specific types of connective tissue last time. We just went over the basics. So what we're going to do now is we're going to spend some time here with connective tissue proper. And then in part 3 of the lecture, we'll cover just briefly fluid connective tissue, and then of course supporting connective tissue. So hopefully by this point you've been able to or are working on being able to draw this table out by hand and organizing the information. I highly suggest you do that. So as I mentioned, we're going to move on to connective tissue proper. And that term proper just means that this is kind of your average connective tissue. The ground substance is quite watery. The fibers are, there are a variety of fibers present. The cells, you find a variety of cells present. So it's kind of your average. Whereas, like, say, for instance, bone would have a hard, solid ground substance and only one type of fiber and only a few types of cells. So supporting connective tissue or bone, for instance, is going to be real specific, whereas connective tissue proper is a little bit more generic, if that makes sense. So the first type of connective tissue proper we're going to learn about is loose connective tissue. And there are 3 specific types, 3 names. There's areolar connective tissue, adipose tissue, and reticular tissue, all of which are loose connective tissue. Loose means that the fibers create a very loose, open framework. That's just kind of a fancy way to say the fibers are loosely present in the matrix itself. Whereas in dense connective tissue, the fibers are very densely packed. So first we'll cover loose and then dense connective tissue, because we covered a lot of information. So what we've just covered is loose connective tissue. That is this section right here. So now we're going to move on to dense connective tissue, this section. So we're still learning about connective tissue proper, okay? So let's go. So the first type of loose connective tissue we're going to cover is called areolar connective tissue. That's what you would call it, or you can call it areolar tissue. And let me explain a couple of things to you before we move on to the specifics. what you see on the left, the picture you see on the left is a drawing, and the picture that you see on the right is actually what it would look like underneath the microscope. And pay attention to the magnification. LM means light microscope, and then 380 is the magnification. Now, before we move on, I want to, you probably have learned this in your Gen Bio class, maybe you forgot, maybe you didn't learn it, but tissue underneath a microscope doesn't actually appear colored. Most tissues are going to be either translucent or beigeish tissue. The reason why you see the pink and the purple colors here in the picture on the right is because we've added biological stains. Stains that will bind to specific molecules and make them appear distinct. Okay, so this areolar connective tissue and all the tissues we look at throughout the semester don't actually exist as color in the human body. So let's just make that clear. Okay, so let's first think about the structure of this tissue. Remember, structure, function, location are really important. So since this is a loose connective tissue, you can see how the fibers are pretty loosely scattered. The fibers in this tissue are, let me change my pen color. The fibers in the tissue are here. This is an elastic fiber, and you can see how those are thin, and they're stained a different color, but don't always go by the color of the stain, right? Don't memorize the stain. And then these purple fibers, those are collagen fibers. And you can immediately see that those collagen fibers are thicker than the elastic fibers, and they're relatively loosely arranged. Other structures that you see would be an adipocyte, right here. That's a fat cell. And normally, if you look over it at it in the picture on the right, this area in the center of the cell, right here, appears clear. But that's only because when they prepared this slide, they didn't stain for the fat. Okay, they didn't add a biological stain. So remember, if you don't add a biological stain, certain parts of tissues will not be visible. So in the drawing over here, in the drawing on the left, they have stained for the lipids on the inside of the cell. Over in the picture on the right, all you can see is that cell membrane there in pink. Okay, so there are going to be adipocytes present in areolar connective tissue. There are also mast cells. Remember those immune cells that secrete histamine and heparin. There will be fibroblasts present. Remember, you can also call those fibrocytes, for now anyway. Remember, the function of fibroblasts or fibrocytes is to secrete the fibers. So if we see the elastic fibers and the collagen fibers present in the tissue, we know that those are non-living structures, and those non-living structures had to be made by something that was living. So the fibroblasts or fibrocytes, they assemble and secrete those fibers. Okay. Another cell that you find present is a macrophage. Remember those phagocytic cells that are going to kind of cruise around in the matrix, phagocytizing pathogens and or cellular debris. So those are the cells, those are the fibers. But now what about the ground substance, the jello? So this is a little bit harder, I guess, to kind of point at. Not really harder to see, but point at. All of this, let me change the color here. I'm going to use yellow. All of this that you kind of see in the background as light pink would be that fluid ground substance. And remember that this is connective tissue proper. So this ground substance that you see in the background, this jello, is going to have the consistency of, I don't know, maybe the consistency of milk. It's not quite the consistency of water. It's a little bit thicker than that. So that's the structure of the tissue explained. Now let's look at where you find this type of tissue. You're going to find this tissue in and underneath, or deep to, the dermis. If you were to touch the skin on your arm, that is the epidermis. Just deep to that skin on your arm, just deep to the epidermis is the dermis. So this is where you find areolar connective tissue. You also find it between your muscles, around blood vessels, around joints, and around nerves. Areolar connective tissue is probably the most abundant type of connective tissue in the body. It's very versatile, and you can see why it's versatile. It's got the two different fiber types. It's got many different cells. It's kind of got this average ground substance, so this is what makes it versatile. Its functional role that it plays in these locations can be protective padding, so kind of like just a little bit of cushioning for certain areas. It will support and bind other tissue. It can hold body fluid. This ground substance that you see here in the background contains a lot of water. So that's the where it would hold body fluid. And also, since we've got macrophages and mast cells, there would be lymphocytes in here too. I'm not sure why they're showing them, not showing them, but these cells would provide an immune response, or would help to initiate an immune response if some sort of pathogen were to enter the tissue. Okay, so that's structure, function, and location of areolar connective tissue. On your connective tissue quiz, I will ask you, I'll show you a picture of areolar connective tissue, and I may ask you to identify these structures, or I might ask you to identify these structures, or I might just point to one of those fibroblasts and not ask you what it is, but I might ask you what it does, what's its function. Or alternatively, I may just show the entire picture and ask you to name one location in the body where you might find it. This is what I'll always do for the histology part of our class, is I'll show you an image, I'll either ask you about its location and its function, or I'll point to a specific thing in that image and also ask you about its location and function. So really start getting used to the structure, function, location questions. Real quick to where the second type of loose connective tissue is what we call adipose tissue. And first we'll cover its structure, then location, and then its function. So as a connective tissue, remember it's going to have three things, right? What are those three things? You can say it with me. Ground substance. I'll just abbreviate that. Ground substance. You're about to say fibers, and then you're going to say cells, right? So although this tissue looks different, and the fibers might not be obvious and the ground substance might not be obvious, they are there because this is a connective tissue. So let's go ahead and look at the ground substance first. I'm going to use the green, and this space in between the cells and in between those purple lines, all of that would be ground substance. So there's not as much ground substance in adipose tissue as you saw in areolar tissue, and that's because the cells are so densely packed. Okay, so kind of in that background, that's where that ground substance is. Then the fibers are going to be collagen and elastin fibers, but they're really difficult to see. These, I shouldn't say really difficult, but more difficult to see. The purple lines that you see there, those are elastic fibers. And then in the background, which is even, you can't even really see them, there would be scattered collagen fibers in the background. I apologize, you can't really see them, so don't worry about that. Don't worry about identifying those collagen fibers on a test. Just know that they're there. And then these are the cells. So those are the adipocytes, and this little structure in the center right there, that's the nucleus. The thing with adipocytes is they hold the lipids inside the cell in kind of like this large vacuole. And when those cells get filled up with lipids, it pushes the nucleus off to the side. So that's why you see those nuclei off to the side of the cell rather than where you're used to seeing them as right there in the center. Okay. Other structures present would be blood vessels. One of the functions of adipose tissue is to be in a good place to store energy. So if you needed to access your fat cells for energy, those lipids would be released out of the adipocytes, and then they have to go into the blood vessels, right? So the cardiovascular system can transport those nutrients to the rest of the body. So that's what those red circles are. If we look at the adipose tissue under 133 times magnification, you see it looks different than drawing, obviously. Again, the person who prepared this slide did not stain for the lipids on the inside. I know these look like empty bubbles, right? But each one of those bubbles that you see is an adipocyte. It just doesn't have the lipids stained, right? If we wanted to draw in a nucleus, we could do that. We could just draw one off to the side here. They didn't stain for the nucleus. And then the fibers would be found in between the adipocytes, and so would that ground substance. And again, I'm not asking you to identify the collagen fibers. I don't even think I asked you to identify the elastic fibers, but know that that's where they would be. Okay, location of adipose tissue. Well, that varies from person to person. It varies across the course of your life. It varies based on your lifestyle, varies based on your diet. So in general, we are going to find adipose tissue deep to the skin. So that skin that you can touch, excuse me, deep to that is going to be some areolar connective tissue, but also there is going to be adipose tissue. Think about this. If you were to gain or lose weight, your arm, for instance, gets bigger or smaller. And the way that happens is those excess calories get stored as lipids in these adipocytes. So these adipocytes physically get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And as they do, if all of the adipocytes in a region get bigger, then that makes your arm, for instance, appear bigger. And it's the adipose cells or the adipocytes that are just deep to the skin that are filling up with lipids or shrinking as you use those lipids. This is what we call subcutaneous fat, or the fat that is the first region where excess energy is stored in those fat cells. Okay. We also find it in the breast region, and that's going to depend on your sex. We can find it in the stomach. I know I've got plenty in my stomach, especially in women. In the pelvic region, we develop, once we get to reproductive age, a little kind of fat pouch right there to protect our internal reproductive structures. Fat is found in the buttocks. It's found around the kidneys, supporting and protecting kidneys, and it's found surrounding the eyeball. Think about the eye sitting in a bony socket in the skull. The eye is a pretty important structure, a pretty important organ. So if you were, bear with me here, I'm not trying to be gross, but if you were to take the eye out of the socket, you'd see that the socket itself would be lined in fat, and the outside of the eye would be lined in fat. Function of connective tissue, as you might assume, padding and a shock absorber. Insulation helps to keep us warm, right? And it's a good source of energy. Chart. The third type of loose connective tissue is reticular tissue. And the name itself might give away what type of fibers are present. The fibers present here are going to be reticular fibers. And the reticular fibers are these blue lines that you see here. But remember, the thing about reticular fibers is they're short and kind of squat and branching. And so what they create is kind of this matrix of support for cells to anchor themselves to. I'm not doing a very good at this drawing, but you can kind of see what I'm attempting to draw over here. So you've got that network, right? So those are going to be the reticular fibers. And then in the background, all of this right here, that light pink area, that's going to be the ground substance. And the cell types will vary because reticular tissue is found in different internal organs, the soft tissue organs. So if we were talking about the liver, for example, the cells that are attached to those reticular fibers would be like liver cells. Or if we're talking about the spleen, they would be spleen cells. There are going to be fibroblasts here too, scattered fibroblasts, but don't worry about having to identify those. We're not asking you to do that. Really, what we would like you to know is that we would like you guys to be able to recognize that this is reticular tissue, and also be able to let me know that we find reticular tissue in bone marrow, in the liver, lymph nodes, I already mentioned kidney and spleen, I think. And its function in those organs is to provide support. So the fibers themselves provide a location where those cells can anchor to. We can visit our off. So now what we're doing is we're moving away from loose connective tissue. Let's go far. So remember that the difference between dense connective tissue and loose connective tissue is the density of the fibers. So in dense connective tissue in general, the fibers are going to be much more densely packed. So within dense connective tissue, there are three types. There's dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and then elastic tissue. Let me just draw some fibers here for you, just so you have an idea of what they might look like in each one of these tissues. So dense regular tissue is got really densely packed fibers, but all those fibers are lined up in exactly the same direction. And usually they're lined up in the direction of what we would call applied forces. So if this were a tendon, for instance, force would come from this direction and that direction. So that if you can imagine kind of pulling on a rubber band, each one of your fingers represents a direction that force is coming from. So you're pulling in two different directions, and that's the direction that the fibers are lined up. So this is a very different structure than dense irregular connective tissue. Dense irregular connective tissue fibers are still densely packed, but there's no patterning to the arrangement of the fibers in the tissue. And the importance of this is that this tissue can take forces or stress from many different directions. So we can pull in that direction, it can be pulled in this direction and that direction, and that makes this type of tissue very versatile. But it's not as strong, it's not as strong as dense regular. Dense regular, because all those fibers are going in the same direction, creates a really tight connection. But if a force comes from this direction or a twisting force is applied to the tissue, then those fibers can tear very easily. Whereas in dense irregular, it can absorb shock and or pull in many different directions. In elastic tissue, it's still a dense connective tissue, obviously, but the fibers are elastic fibers. Maybe I didn't mention it before, so I'll mention it now. In dense connective tissue, in dense regular anyway, the fibers are collagen fibers, and that's the same as in dense irregular. So the fibers that are present in elastic tissue are, just as the name implies, elastic fibers. And they're going to be arranged parallel. sort of like dense regular, but the fibers are different. All right. So because elastic tissue has elastic fibers, you can expect that tissue to be elastic in nature. So you're going to be able to apply forces to it, let's say in these two directions, and those fibers will easily stretch and then go right back to their resting length. Whereas with the collagen fibers in like dense regular, you can only apply so much force until those fibers rip and tear, and they will not bounce back like rubber bands. Okay, we learned about that in the first connective tissue lecture. Let's look at some specific examples of dense regular connective tissue. And I apologize for the formatting. Sometimes when I switch to this whiteboard, I lose my PowerPoint formatting. So specific locations or specific examples of dense regular connective tissue include things like tendons and ligaments. So let me just change my color here. Over on the left, this is a drawing of a tendon. And over on the right, this is what a tendon looks like underneath the microscope, magnified 440 times. So with dense regular connective tissue, check it out. You can see the fibers. They're kind of squiggly. And I'm not doing a great job of outlining them, but you get my point. The fibers are all going in the same direction, and they're really densely packed. Well, also, where did those fibers come from? Well, they came from these cells, right? The fibroblasts. Now, these authors are saying, well, those are the fibroblast nuclei. Don't worry about that. I don't know why they're just pointing to the nuclei. So those are fibroblasts. Remember, the function of fibroblasts is to assemble and secrete the fibers. So if you've got fibers there, you must have fibroblasts there. And I don't have a ligament underneath the microscope or a drawing of a ligament underneath the microscope, but I can show you one here. You guys might know about that ligament. This is the anterior cruciate ligament, and that one is found in the knee, inside the knee capsule, and is often torn in sports injuries. I've torn mine. Some of you may have torn yours as well, and it hurts too. And anyway, I won't get off on a tangent, but that's an example of a ligament. So what do tendons do? They attach muscle to bone, and they're made of collagen fibers only. Here's an exception where when we're talking about ligaments, ligaments are really similar to tendons except for they attach bone to bone. So you can see the ACL attaching your femur to your tibia here. Their structure's a little bit different. They're a mix of collagen and elastin fibers. And the presence of those elastin fibers in the ligaments makes your ligaments a little bit more stretchy and therefore allows for movement at your joints. Imagine if a ligament was just made of collagen fibers. You'd have a really strong connection between two bones, but you might not be able to bend at that joint, right? We've got to have elasticity or mobility at our joints. And so the ligaments are going to, and the elastic fibers in those ligaments allow for increased mobility at our joints. And here is elastic tissue, and it kind of looks similar to dense, just the dense regular we looked at before, except for now the fibers are elastic fibers. All right, so here's some elastic fibers. And the fibroblasts are going to be those little purple dots right here. So with elastic tissue, you've got large amounts of elastic fibers, which creates a bouncy and resilient structure to the tissue. And the reason for that, the result of that is tissues that contain, elastic tissue can tolerate expansion and contraction. So, for instance, the aorta, which is the largest vessel carrying blood away from your heart, it's got a layer of elastic tissue embedded in it, because when your heart beats and squeezes blood up and out of the heart and into the aorta, it does so at significant pressure. So the aorta has the ability to expand to accommodate the blood flowing through, and then contract again when there isn't actively any blood flowing through. The reason the aorta is able to do that is because it's got some of this elastic tissue embedded in the wall of the vessel. Another example of dense regular connective tissue is an aponeurosis. Let me explain a couple things to you here first. This slide really should be moved before the elastic tissue slide, because elastic tissue is sort of different than, it's a different example of dense regular connective tissue. Here we have an aponeurosis, which is made of collagen fibers, right? Not elastic fibers. So I should have clumped all of those examples of dense regular with just collagen all together. So I apologize. Anyways, let's look at the ending of this word first, as I hope you've read in your lab activities. Oftentimes when these anatomical terms end in ES, that means that's the plural form. If we were talking about an aponeurosis, just one, we would have that word end in IS. So to make that word plural, we change the I to an E. So an aponeurosis is singular, aponeuroses is plural. So start training your eye to recognize those things too. So an aponeurosis is a big, broad, flat tendon, essentially. So they're common in the lumbar region and in the abdominal region, and sometimes they cover muscle. But really what they're meant to do, this author has sort of cut away the rest of the aponeurosis here, but if we could draw part of that aponeurosis back in, or some of the fibers back in, it would attach this oblique abdominal muscle right to the midline. So the function of these aponeuroses is to assist in attaching superficial muscles to either another muscle or a nearby structure. So you've got this big, broad, oblique muscle right here, this internal oblique muscle. Well, you're going to need a big, broad, flat tendon to attach it to the midline, right? Okay, and then the last type of tissue we'll cover for part 2 here is dense irregular. And dense irregular, remember the fibers, there's no pattern, they're kind of just scattered. They're still densely packed, but you don't have that nice arrangement like we see in dense regular. So in this micrograph, what you see here, these are the fibers. I hope you can see my red pen over the pink there. Some of these are going in this direction, some of them are going in this direction, some of them are almost in a squiggly direction. So you don't have them all nice and densely packed, right? And then the fibroblasts, which have to be present because fibroblasts make the fibers, you can find scattered throughout the tissue. Where we find dense irregular is pretty common. We find it in the dermis. We find it around the viscera, or your internal organs. And you find it in sheaths around nerves and around muscle. And its function is to do a few things here. Let me pull this up so you can see it. It assists in protecting those structures. But also one of its main functions is to resist forces coming from many directions. So force can come from this direction, almost an infinite number of directions, really. And the tissue won't get damaged. So this is what makes this tissue quite versatile. And here we are. We are at the end of part 2. I didn't realize we were coming to the end so quickly. What we've covered so far are the 2 main types of connective tissue proper. We looked at areolar tissue, adipose tissue, reticular tissue, and then also dense regular, dense irregular. I don't know what happened to elastic tissue. Okay, so we've looked at the structure, function, and location of all of these tissues, and we've also learned a little bit about how loose and dense connective tissue are organized into connective tissue proper. When we come back for the 3rd lecture for connective tissue, we'll breeze right by fluid connective tissue, and then I'm going to introduce to you cartilage and bone. Okay, see you next time.